I want you to, for a moment, journey back with me to a simpler time when I was but a young, budding teenager. I'd come home from school in 4th, 5th, 6th grade. There were great cartoons to watch after school was over. I would have my fill of the Jetsons, the Transformers, and G.I. Joe. Throughout these cartoons, a number of commercials came, and if you grew up during the time that I grew up, you'll remember some of these. I want to highlight one of them as an introduction to our message this morning. Check it out.
It's yours?
No,
Your mother said she found it in your closet.
I don't know. One of the guys must have...
Must have what?
Look, Dad, it's not
Where
mine.
did you get it?
Dad,
Answer me. Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
Parents who use drugs have children who use drugs.
How many of you remember that commercial? How many of you have seen that one? If you didn't get to see it live, chances are at some point in time it's shown up somewhere. One of the most quotable commercials, I think, certainly of my upgrade. Very formative. I mean, back then there was a lot of these anti-drug campaigns, right? You remember the fried egg in the frying pan, right? This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions, right? And this was another one that was featured practically every single day of my life. I find it interesting that it was being played during cartoons for kids when it was really, I think, primarily a message for parents, right? I mean, that was essentially the message was parents who use drugs have kids who use drugs. Now, how many of you noticed that the father here, he was indignant, right? He was beside himself to discover that his child was doing something that he considered to be so awful, right? And so there he is accusing, bringing this whole thing to the forefront, right? Just beside himself. How could my kid be doing this? And then, of course, you know, the big twist in the commercial is, Dad, I did this. I learned this by watching you. And boy, how many of you have had an encounter at some point in your life where you were suddenly arrested by a realization of how you were guilty of doing something that you were accusing somebody else of doing, right? So if you haven't guessed already, our topic for today is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. This is going to be a fun one, right? We all love talking about hypocrisy. We often think about hypocrisy as being an exact exchange of doing something that you've told someone else not to do, right? The whole do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. And none of us, nobody in this room, nobody watching online today, none of us are excluded from having these moments of hypocrisy in our lives. But did you know that hypocrisy is not limited, certainly not limited. In fact, I don't even think the lion's share of hypocrisy that occurs in our lives has anything to do with how we have told somebody to not do some particular specific thing, or that we've judged somebody for some particular specific thing and then gone and done it ourselves. That's not usually the way in which hypocrisy is played out in our lives. Usually it's more like we have judged somebody for some particular thing, right? Or told somebody not to do some particular thing, and then we do something else that is practically the same thing. And that's one of the things that makes hypocrisy so difficult to identify in our lives. It's not that I said, don't do X, and then I go and do X. It's that I say, don't do X, and then I go and do Y, but Y is essentially the equivalent of X, and I'm unable to even actually see that for myself. That's the kind of hypocrisy that oftentimes our lives encounter. Hypocrisy is all about keeping favor, right? It's not just simply about trying to get away with doing something that you hope other people don't find out. That's kind of what we think about it as oftentimes, right? That the hypocrisy is simply wanting to do something, but hiding that thing from other people. That's not necessarily just hypocrisy. I mean, that could be dishonesty, right? That could be concealing, the secrets of our lives. Hypocrisy is really, when you kind of boil it down to what motivates hypocrisy in our lives, it's all about keeping favor, of finding favor with a person or a crowd or a kind of people, right? And then wanting to maintain that. And so hypocrisy is setting up this pretense. It's this mask, this disguise that we put on so that people will think or see us differently from the way we are inside as they look at our outside. They will see one thing as they consider, kind of the exterior show that we're putting on, but that thing is different. It doesn't line up with what is actually inside of us. Jesus, in Luke chapter 11, we're gonna look at Luke 12, a few verses there. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. But in Luke 11, Jesus goes through this whole entire list of kind of accusations that he makes against the religious elite of his day. Right? He begins talking to them, and one of the things that Jesus found so surprising among this particular group of people was how important they thought the outside of things were compared with the inside. Right? The story starts by Jesus goes into a Pharisee's home and he has a meal with them. And while all the good religious people are busy doing the ceremonial hand washing before they eat, Jesus sits at the table, he just dives in. Right? It's kind of the equivalent of, let's say you went to eat with a whole bunch of really spiritual people. I don't even know some really spiritual people. Right? People that, boy, you barely can stand to even be in their presence because they're so spiritual. They're so holy. They're so close to Jesus, right? And you go and you sit at a table with them and you just see somebody kind of sit down and start diving in. And you're like, aren't we supposed to pray before we eat or something, right? Like the ceremony of praying before our meal would be kind of like that. And so here you have these religious people that are busy washing their hands while the food's getting cold, and Jesus he just dives in. And he can tell that they are incensed by the fact that he has not performed the washing of his hands prior to eating. And you know what Jesus says to them? He looks at them and he goes, you guys, you knuckleheads, you guys are you're so bothered by the outside of the cup, right? You're so careful to wash the outside of the cup, but inside it's dirty and gross. The part where you put the actual liquid into and then transfer that liquid into your body that has been contaminated because the inside of the cup is dirty, because you don't care about the inside, you only care about the outside. And Jesus is just kind of bringing to light the reality that, many of us, we're so concerned about how we look, how we come off to other people, and oftentimes think very, very little about what's inside. What's inside of this guy? What's going on inside of this person? What is really the thing or those things that compose, this human being? Because listen, it is far more than the clothes that you wear or even the things that you say or even many of the actions that we perform. Right? The question is, what's going on inside? Hypocrisy is all about keeping favor, of trying to appeal to a person or a group of people by aligning yourself with them and what you think they want. What do they want to hear from you? What do they want to think? What do you want them to think about you? All the while, it doesn't line up with what is on the inside. So Luke chapter 12, we'll read verses 1 through 3 together. It says, meanwhile, the crowds grew until thousands were milling about and stepping on each other. And Jesus turned first to his disciples, and he warned them. He said, beware, or some of your translations will better translate what Jesus says, pay attention to yourselves. That's literally what Jesus says. He says, pay attention to yourselves. That's going to come up a little later. Pay attention to yourselves of the yeast of the Pharisees, which is their hypocrisy. Now, I get that's a little weird. We'll talk about exactly what Jesus is saying here. But beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, their hypocrisy. The time is coming when everything that is covered up will be revealed, and all that is secret will be made known to all. Whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered behind closed doors will be shouted from the housetops for all to hear. Now, I don't know about you, but just those couple of verses there is enough to create a little bit of fright in me. How about you? The idea that everything that has been said in secret is going to be shouted from the housetops. How many of you have said some things that you'd prefer not get shouted from the housetops? That everything that has been done in secret is going to be laid out in the open for all to see? How many of you have done a thing or two in your life that you'd rather other people didn't know about, right? But Jesus, he is speaking of this time that's coming, that for those who have done their best to conceal what's inside, to conceal from others what is not immediately transparent, or who have play acted through their lives, the day of truth is coming. So, what is a hypocrite, right? Jesus says to his disciples, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, their hypocrisy. What is a hypocrite? Many of you who have kind of been in the Bible for a while, you know that this word that we translate hypocrite comes from a Greek word that spoke of somebody like an actor on stage, right? That for a long period in this word's history, there was no real negative connotation to what it meant. It simply referred to a person that performed on stage, especially one maybe that wore a mask. At times, there'd be a chorus, and there would be somebody that would translate what it is that the chorus was doing, or would create this kind of like sing and response type of performance, right? That was the hypocrite, right? Again, not speaking negatively of who that person was. They were performing for a crowd. But among Hebrew culture, it came to take on this kind of negative meaning to it, to refer to somebody who, in an analogous sort of way, wore a mask, or somebody that was disingenuous, somebody that was pretending, or that had created a pretense around them so that other people would see something differently on the outside from what was actually on the inside. So that's what a hypocrite is. And you and I, we understand how that hypocrisy kind of plays out. We've encountered it. We've been guilty of it, right? That we have said one thing, we've done another. We've seen other people say one thing, and then all of a sudden, we find out on the news they've done something completely different from that, right? And what do? Oh, look at the hypocrite, right? The hypocrite. Now, hypocrisy is, of course, one of the great enemies of the church, of the people of God. It has been, and properly so a lot of times, one of the great problems that people who are not in a relationship with Jesus have had or held against people who are following Jesus, because they perhaps see, right, on occasion, the hypocrisy that comes from a person that is known for being very judgmental, a person that has railed against wrongdoing and evil and wickedness, and all the while they're kind of privately practicing their own wickedness, right? And then all of a sudden it comes to light, right? And we think, what a hypocrite, what a hypocrite. So that's what a hypocrite is. And Jesus says hypocrisy is like yeast, right? That's how he speaks to his disciples. He says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, which is their hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is like yeast. Now, what is yeast? Well, we know yeast is used in order to cause something like bread to expand. Right? We leaven bread. We make our bread by putting yeast in it, right? That mold sort of creates gas, which then puffs up and makes what would otherwise be a flat, dense loaf of bread something that is delicious and yummy, right? So Jesus says hypocrisy is like yeast. Well, what does he mean? Well, he means that it's a small thing, but it affects everything. Now, back when, of course, Jesus said this, people didn't go to their grocery store into aisle 3 and grab some Fleischmann's Rapid Rise yeast in a package, right? Like you and I do today, right? We get that little package of yeast, we cut it open, we put it in, right? And it's easy, and it doesn't look like there's anything evil about it. But we see this subject of yeast being used as an analogy for evil or hypocrisy throughout the New Testament. And the reason is because of the way in which yeast was used. You see, back then, they would leaven their bread by reserving a small lump of the bread that they made for that day. And they would put it aside, right? So they would bake the larger portion of the bread, but they'd hold back just a portion of that dough, and then they would allow it to ferment. Right? And over the course of the next day, they didn't have refrigeration. So that thing would be out and it would get nasty. That yeast, right, itself would mold, right? So that it would itself be capable of producing the gases that were necessary for the next day's batch of bread. And that's exactly what they did. They would take that yucky, moldy, kind of gross piece of dough and they would fold it into the dough for the next day. And what did it do? Well, it took over everything. It was just a small portion of the bread that they were making, and yet it affected everything. And that's what Jesus says hypocrisy is like. You see, a lot of times when hypocrisy exists in our lives, we try our best to compartmentalize it, right? To make whatever that hypocrisy is in our life just something that is not, it's just a piece of us, right? There's this little something that I don't want other people to know about me. There's this little something I don't want for that to get out, or I want to maintain the veil over this, the way that I think, or what I'm doing, or what I'm speaking to others in smaller, more private circles, right? But Jesus says, no, you can't keep hypocrisy in this little tiny, well-kept compartment of your life. It actually affects everything. It is pervasive. It's pervasive. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to have surgery on my face. I have been diagnosed with a skin cancer. And it's the quote-unquote good kind, right? The good kind of skin cancer. The doctors described to me that this is the kind of skin cancer that doesn't have a tendency to spread. It is, in essence, encapsulated within kind of the little cell or tumor that it exists. And so what they'll do to remedy it is they will cut my face open and just dig it out. And that's the end of it, hopefully. Right? For the most part, that's how you deal with this thing, and that's fine. Maybe you get another one somewhere else, but like in and of itself, it's just its own little thing. That's very different from 8 years ago. I was diagnosed with lymphoma. And back then, what the doctors discovered was like a fist-sized tumor in my chest. And even in the diagnosis of that lymphoma, some testing had to be done to find out, well, just how bad is this? Right? And so as I'm in the hospital and they first biopsy, they cut open my chest, they biopsy the tumor to find out exactly what it is, like what kind of cancer are we dealing with. But then they did the most awful thing to me after that, after they had figured out what it was. Then they came in and did another procedure on me where they turned me over on my bed, they pulled my pants partway down, and they ground into my buttocks with some kind of tool in order to extract bone marrow. It was a bone marrow biopsy. Literally the most painful thing I've ever undergone in my life. You know why they did that? They did it because they wanted to know, are we talking about lymphoma that essentially exists currently as this tumor, or is it worse, right? Is it in the marrow? Has it gotten into the lymph nodes, right? That's what they're trying to discern. And hypocrisy, it's not like the skin cancer. It's not like the isolated tumor that they can go ahead and deal with or cut out or however they're going to kind of deal. It's pervasive. It's pervasive, like some cancers that people have experienced where, you know, the really bad news is, hey, this is kind of taken over your entire body. And that's what Jesus says hypocrisy is like. It's like yeast. And here's the problem with hypocrisy is that it's not easily detectable. It's not easily detectable. When it comes to hypocrisy in our lives, like the hypocrisy that you and I are guilty of, it's really, really hard for us to see our own hypocrisy. It's not like, you look in the mirror most days and you can just see your life. Because again, like we think of hypocrisy as just being this outright, like I said don't do this and then I go and do that, right? That's what we think of when it comes to hypocrisy. But hypocrisy it's so much deeper and really broader than that, right? Because it's far more has to do with what we have justified in our own lives that is wrong, but that we are now unable to identify ourselves. And that's why Jesus says to his disciples, pay attention to yourselves. Like, pay attention to yourself. What we do is we pay attention to other people, right? We pay a lot of attention to what other people are doing, or how they're behaving, or how they're talking, or how they sound, right? Or what they posted on Facebook, what they said to me, how they acted toward me. We have so much attention directed on what other people are doing or how other people are acting. But Jesus says, pay attention to yourself. There's a little bit of MYOB in this matter of hypocrisy. See, this leaven, the errors of the Pharisees, he says, pay attention that you don't fall into exactly the same trap that they themselves have fallen into. Hypocrisy, it's not easily detectable. And so sometimes we need a little bit of help, right? Sometimes we need that, hey, take a good look in the mirror, right? That's what this kid is essentially saying to his dad in the commercial we watched a few moments ago. Like, Dad, I get you're incensed that I have started doing this, and I'm not supposed to be doing this. And I get why you're angry, but hey, do me a favor for a second. Take a good look in the mirror, because you're doing exactly the same thing. Hypocrisy is not easily detectable. Hypocrisy also, and this is part of the challenge of it, is that it feeds on praise, right? We started, as we were looking at hypocrisy, at talking about the idea that hypocrisy seeks to please others, right? To gain their favor or to keep the favor of a particular group. And hypocrisy finds its food on this thing called praise, on the approval of other people. As we looked at the beginning of the story, Luke describes the scene for us. He said, the crowds grew. He essentially gave us that the idea that the crowd had come to be innumerable. He uses the word used for 10,000 people, or just used generically of an innumerable number of people had begun to gather around Jesus, right? That there was, to some degree, a rapidly growing popularity for this figure Jesus and his disciples, so much so that now they were stepping over each other and trampling on one another. And Jesus, as he is there with his disciples, viewing the expansive crowd, understands that he has to warn, he has to caution his disciples against the temptation that they are naturally going to feel as they view the crowds that have come to see them and to hear from them. It would be tempting for Jesus and his disciples to grow to like the crowd, right? And to not only having received the favor of the crowd, but then wanting to maintain the favor of that crowd. That is what the Jewish leaders had been guilty of so many times in their lives, is this desire to have attributed to them the praises of other people, the applause of men and women. And Jesus says, beware, or watch yourselves. Pay attention to yourself that you don't grow to love the crowd. You see, we find ourselves, especially, I feel like, in just these days in which we live, having the temptation to align ourselves with the right crowd, right? The people that are in power, the people that seem to kind of hold the cards at any given time. And we want to be aligned with the right people, and sometimes we actually kind of give up on what we know is right for ourselves because we know that we have to align ourselves with what other people think. And not only that, but we have to show contempt, right, to the right degree for the people that the people in power don't like. And we find ourselves, instead of actually living out this thing called love, instead of actually living out the kind of graciousness that Jesus would have in our lives, we jump in with a group of people, and in a desire to earn and keep their favor, we practice what they practice. We say what they say. We go along with what they want. Hypocrisy feeds on praise. Here, to this degree, listen to this. In John chapter 12, Jesus, in his analysis of the people that had surrounded him, and in John's description of what was going on, he says, Jesus did many miraculous things there. Like Jesus was just performing all kinds of miracles. And the commentary of John says that many believed in him. That makes sense, right? I mean, here Jesus is just essentially demonstrating his power, his connectedness to the Father through the miracles that he was performing, which were signs that attributed the reality of who he was to who he was. And it says many people believed in him. And then John says this, he said many people did believe in him, however, including some of the Jewish leaders, but they wouldn't admit it for fear that the Pharisees would expel them from the synagogue, for they loved human praise more than the praise of God. That it had actually come to the point where people, they actually believed that Jesus was from God, that the acts, the signs that he was performing were something to behold, but they wouldn't admit it because they were more afraid of how they were going to be treated in their church or their synagogue. That the Pharisees, right, the people that were in power, would kick them out. How often do we see that today in kind of this thing that has come to be known as the cancel culture, right? Where it used to be okay and proper for a person to express freely what is on their mind, whether they were right or completely and crazily wrong, right? And then the freedom to actually converse, right? And to have conversations and to disagree with people that had a way of thinking that was different, maybe even wrong, right? But it was still permitted. Today, you can't do that, right? Today, you get canceled, right? You lose a job because you said the wrong thing, because you infuriated the wrong people, because you didn't align yourself with those who are in power. And so we, as followers of Jesus, we have to understand that we too live in a day and age in which we're going to be tempted to want to hold on to the thoughts of those that we want to please, that we want to earn favor with, right? But we don't want to fall into the same category that these people that believed in Jesus, yet kept their mouths shut. That tells us that hypocrisy is a powerful thing. Hypocrisy will make you act the opposite of how you believe. Right? And that's the danger of hypocrisy. Not that, hey, you know what? I'm just kind of keeping this little tiny thing in my life a secret from everybody else. It's not hurting anybody. It's not going to bother anybody. It's just, there's this little pretense in my life. No, Jesus says hypocrisy is like yeast. It pervades everything. And it's so dangerous that it will actually make you act the opposite of how you believe. As an example, we have in Paul's letter to the Galatians this instance where Paul says, he had to stand up against another very powerful figure in the early church, the Apostle Peter. Right? He says, when Peter came to Antioch, I had to oppose him to his face, for he did what was very wrong. Well, what did Peter do? What was Peter guilty of? Well, when he first arrived, he ate with the Gentile believers, right? The non-Jewish people. They weren't circumcised, right? They hadn't gone through this religious rite of circumcision, right? Because it was unnecessary. And everybody agreed that it was unnecessary, that Jesus had now kind of brought us out from the law and into a direct relationship with the Father through the grace of God, right? And so Peter, when he shows up, he's there, he's happy, right? Sit down at table with all these non-Jewish people, eating away, conversing, fellowshipping, right? Enjoying their time together. But then all of a sudden, some friends of James came. Now, James he's the pastor of the Jewish church in Jerusalem. He's a bigwig, right? And he's got some friends, some probably powerful Jewish people. They showed up, and here's what Peter did. It said Peter wouldn't, in their company, eat with the Gentiles anymore. He was afraid of criticism from these people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. And as a result, other Jewish believers followed Peter's hypocrisy, and even Barnabas. Even Barnabas is like, again, he's like the most spiritual guy you've ever known, right? Barnabas does everything right. And he says, even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. What's going on here? Well, Peter starts acting differently from what he knows is right because he wants to make some religious people happy. Right? Hypocrisy is all about maintaining favor with other people, even though it goes against what you know is right inside. So what we really come down to is kind of the heart of the matter when it comes to hypocrisy, and it's this question. It's this question: whom do you want to please? Whom do you, in your life, whom do you want to please? With whom do you want to have favor? What we're most often tempted to do is gravitate toward wanting favor from other people, when what we should be looking for is a desire for favor with God. You see, you and I, we might have this ability to divide our activities between things that are public and things that are private, right? We all have the things or the way in which we act when we're in public, and we all have the things that we do in the privacy of our homes or in our lives. We separate between what people can see and what people can't see, and sometimes we make this wall, and that wall that's formed that kind of keeps people from peering into the reality of who we are, what we are inside. It protects our minds, right? And it helps us to rationalize our behavior, but the reality is that nothing is hidden from God. Nothing. And that's the fallacy of hypocrisy, is that it only serves a temporary purpose. It doesn't really do what we want it to do. We want to maintain the favor of others, but as Jesus says, there is nothing covered that will not be uncovered. There is nothing hidden that will not be known. Right? Jesus, again, speaking to, listen, I get you feel like you're kind of getting away with this for now, right? And you have held on to, you have secured the favor of other people. But the secrets will be known. So, what is the solution for hypocrisy? What is the solution? A few suggestions I would make as we think about, again, this is something that every single one of us is going to wrestle with. In fact, I venture to say, we all wrestle with this right now. Some form of hypocrisy that is in our lives. If not, then you're perfect. I get it. So you can preach next week, okay? But for the rest of us, hypocrisy is something that we're going to constantly be up against. And so we need to employ these solutions in our lives. The first solution, I think, is this thing called humility. What we all need when it comes to our hypocrisy is a big, giant, vaccinated dose, maybe 2 doses separated by a month apart of humility. Humility, like real humility, not fake humility. Man, we're good at fake humility so many times, right? Of pretending that we are more humble than we actually are. But what we need is humility. Like I said before, our hypocrisy is not usually, I said don't do X and then I go do X. It's, I said don't do X and I went and did Y. That's what, if you read Luke 11 and see the accusations that Jesus makes against the religious people, that's exactly what he's doing. He's like, you have presumed to act this way while you're kind of completely doing this other thing that's just totally different from that. Like those things don't jive with each other. In fact, you have come to even this place where you could use the law, right? And use this veiled righteousness to mask the real deplorable wickedness and emptiness in your life, right? Because you have done everything you can do to follow all of these rules, all these things that people can see. But man, your spirit is dead and your heart is black. So we need humility. Humility serves as an error detector. It gives us the ability to kind of pull down the veil, pull down the wall, and actually see where we are wrong. 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says, if you think you are standing strong, be careful not to fall. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. We've probably all uttered the phrase at some point in time, there, but for the grace of God, go I. That needs to be more than just a phrase. It needs to be a real, genuine understanding that, boy, there's a lot of things that I haven't done or that I haven't been guilty of that is, no credit to me. It's but for the grace of God. The second thing besides humility we need is this thing called vulnerability. Vulnerability. Vulnerability has the ability to outshout the noise of the crowd. You see, with enough validation in our lives, we can mask any sin. I can do practically anything in my life if I am able to get enough applause and approval from other people, even for other things in my life. How many times have you just kind of heard the story of, some person that the entire world just looked to as the example for how to live life, right? It just seemed like they did everything right and everything was about them was good. And all the while there's just like, there's this dirt. There are these secrets. And ultimately they surface, right? How could they do that? How could they have done that? How could they have done that for so long? Well, they did it because the crowds that formed around them, it gave them enough validation that they were able to mask their sin. Jesus said to the Pharisees, what sorrow awaits you, Pharisees, for you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore justice and the love of God. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things. So don't let the validation that others have provided in your life, don't let that become an opportunity for you to mask some sin, some secret, some wickedness toward God. And then finally, cultivate a desire to please God above all else. Again, this is really the heart of the matter. Who do I want to make happy? Like, do I want to preach in such a way that like the crowd is happy? Do I want to preach in such a way that people that are maybe in the same line of work as I am, influencers and people like that I want to make them think, wow, what a great person he is. Do I want to operate in my life in such a way that I am looking for the approval of other people? Or am I really, really cultivating deep down inside a desire to please God above everything else? That's really what it's all about. So as we close today, the band's going to lead us in this song. Let's come to the altar. As we do that this morning, as we stand here in the presence of God and spend a few moments just contemplating our own lives, I pray that you and I would do just that we would grow in our desire above anything else, not to please the preacher, not to please the person or the people in our small group, not to please even merely the people in our own homes, but God, let me come to a place where above all else, more than anything else, I want my life to please you. Let's pray. Father, I just ask, Lord, in the closing moments of our time together, would you just open up our hearts and our minds to see where perhaps we need to change. I pray that you would just by your Spirit speak softly, tenderly to us. bring the necessary conviction that we need to see, like, where have we been hypocrites in our lives? Where have we said in one place that love is the most important thing, but then have done so many things that are really contrary to the law of love ourselves? Lord, where have we extolled the virtues of some things, but have lived entirely different or separated from those things? Lord, what are those things that we are concealing, trying to keep secret, hoping that it will not get out? God, would you just help us to be honest with ourselves, honest with you? Let us grow in our humility, our vulnerability, and our desire to please you above all else. We pray this in Jesus' name.